Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to talk about some interesting poetry that I have encountered, going along with the December holiday theme, although I couldn't really find a holiday poem that spoke to me, but I did find a winter-themed poem, which we are near the winter solstice, so I figured that would work too. And today's poem is all about the shadows that you see around a fire, whether they be inert or possibly suspiciously spooky. I am referring to Winter Dusk by Walter de la Mare. For those who don't know, Walter de la Mare was an English author who lived between the 1800s and the mid-1900s. He primarily wrote children's stories, and he earned a lot of acclaim for that. But he also wrote longer form horror novels, including children's stories and stories for adults. A lot of what he focused on was the supernatural, the spooky, also focusing on the mind and internal related stuff there, some of which you see in this poem that I'm going to be talking about today. Very interesting that he primarily wrote for children. I just because I don't think that was more of I don't think children were the focus of literature too often in the 1800s. So for someone to be focusing on that is significant. I think the only examples that come to mind are the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and this person, Walter de la Mare. I'm sure I'll find others, but I imagine the fact that children can be readers too wasn't something that gained a lot of notoriety until maybe the mid-1900s. But it is fascinating to see what Walter de la Mare was writing for children at that time. So without further ado, let's talk about Winter Dusk. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. Winter Dusk. Dark frost was in the air without. The dusk was still with cold and gloom, when less than even a shadow came and stood within the room. But of the three around the fire, none turned a questioning head to look. Still read a clear voice on and on, still stooped they o'er their book. The children watched their mother's eyes moving on softly line to line. It seemed to listen to that shade, yet made no outward sign. The fire flames crooned a tiny song. No cold wind stirred the wintry tree. The children both in fairy dreamed beside their mother's knee. And nearer yet that spirit drew, above the heedless one, intent only on what the simple words of her small story meant. No voiceless sorrow grieved her mind, no memory her bosom stirred, nor dreamed she, as she read to two, 'twas surely three who heard. Yet when, the story done, she smiled from face to face, serene and clear, a love half-dread sprang up, as she leaned close and drew them near. And so that was Winter Dusk by Walter de la Mare. In terms of analysis, I was a little confused by what was happening in the poem when I first read it. In terms of narrative, my best guess is that there's a shadow, maybe a ghost of some sort, maybe the shadow of death, in the room while a mother is reading to her children. The shadow doesn't seem to be doing anything. Maybe it's waiting on something to happen, or it's biding its time, waiting for a chance to strike. But at the end of the poem, the mother finishes reading and then draws the kids closer to her as the kids presumably sleep. Now, that's more of a literal interpretation. What I think the shadow represents in this poem is the concept of death, or the encroaching darkness, or the as winter comes, because once winter gets here, nights get shorter and shorter until spring, when they get longer and longer. So with those nights getting shorter and shorter, like the shadows and the creatures in the darkness, they could be waiting to strike ever closer. And so this could be more of a literal interpretation, or like a figurative interpretation, just representing the concept of death during winter, or the encroaching darkness as the nights get shorter. But I do think Walter de la Mare does a really good job of adding to the horror element, adding to the dread that is experienced in the poem. Because in the first verse, he says, "The dusk was still with cold and gloom," kind of a very sad and gray kind of atmosphere, "when less than even a shadow came." What's less than a shadow? That's a good question. I ask you that out there, if you want to answer it at all. "And stood within the room." So it's kind of watching people within this room, kind of really, really creepy. But also, like, the shadow doesn't seem to be doing anything in this poem. It's just watching. So it said, "It seemed to listen to the shade, yet made no outward sign." And what's more is the people in the room, like, they don't even notice it. So is it the regular shadows from the fire that might be going on? Or is it is the fact that, like, this shadow can only be seen by those who are near death? Unclear. I like that Walter de la Mare kind of leaves it up to the readers to answer. And then he also says in a later verse, like, "No cold wind stirred the wintry tree. The children both in fairy dreamed beside their mother's knee." So again, the mother is reading to the children, and the children are dreaming about fairy. So adding another supernatural element to this poem. And then to add even more to the dread, you get the last verse where de la Mare says, "Yet when the story done, she smiled from face to face, serene and clear," kind of smiling there. "A love half dread sprang up as she leaned close and drew them near." Maybe she's feeling the presence of the shadow, even though she might not be able to see it. And like she's like, "Oh, I gotta protect my children at this point." Like there's this feeling of dread building up, and as with all feelings of dread, you don't quite know what the source of it is. So I do think that nobody really can see the shadow in this case, but maybe it's just that they don't see it yet. And I think that adds to the dread of the reader, like, turn around, you got to protect your children and stuff like that. Another thing worth noting about the poem is the structure of it. It is A, B, C, B in every single verse. So there's like there's a line rhyme kind of rhythm to it, which makes it a lot of fun to read. But I also think that this is kind of meant for children as well, as we've seen with many of de la Mare's poems before in the past. So it doesn't really change the nature of this poem, but it does present a rhyme, kind of like a fairy tale of sorts. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Winter Dusk by Walter de la Mare, a pretty spooky poem that you don't often find in December, but one that kind of reminds me of the overall winterness going on, how it can be, it gets darker sooner and it gets kind of creepier outside, and you want to huddle up for warmth because who knows what shadows lurk around. I definitely recommend that you go out and read this, as well as de la Mare's other works, because he has a lot of interesting ideas in his poetry. I do want to check out more of his longer form novels to see what kind of creepy things he wrote about there. That would be interesting. If you have any thoughts on this, or you want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem, this poet, or Poetry Thursday if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and wintry travels. Farewell.